Welcome to Perry Worldhouse, the University of Pennsylvania's hub for global engagement. My name is Michael Horowitz. I am the interim director of Perry Worldhouse and a political science professor. And we're very pleased that you could join us for today's event, a virtual edition of The World Today titled, Will COVID-19 Infect the U.S. China Relationship? Before I introduce our panelists, I want to lay out a few ground rules. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see something that says a Q&A. Please click there and enter questions if you have them. To the right of that, you'll see something that's labeled chat. Please use that for any general technical questions, or if there's something in particular you wanna reach out to our team running the event for. Also, please keep it clean, safe for work, appropriate. Everybody wins. And without further ado, I want to introduce the three amazing panelists that we have for the event today. Jacques Delisle is the Stephen A. Cozen Professor of Law, Professor of Political Science, and Director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. Amy Gadsden is Associate Vice Provost for Global Initiatives and the Executive Director of Penn China Initiatives at the University of Pennsylvania. And Avery Goldstein, who was foolish enough to hire me to work at the University of Pennsylvania, is the David M. Knott Professor of Global Politics and International Relations and Political Science. He was the inaugural director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China and is the associate director of the Brown Center for International Politics. And to disrupt the alphabet, we'll be going in reverse alphabetical order. Each speaker will give opening remarks of a few minutes. I'll ask them a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So with that, I want to turn it over to esteemed Professor Goldstein to kick us off.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to keep this brief, as you asked us to. I'm just going to really tick off four what I see as key factors that are shaping U.S. China rivalry. And the title of the panel has something to do with will COVID-19 or the pandemic infect the relationship? I think the problems in the relationship, the rivalry between the United States and China, that was a pre-existing condition, as we like to say today, which has made the pandemic something that's really exacerbating a troubled relationship from the get-go. And I'm going to talk about two international factors and two domestic factors that I think are relevant. Won't get into much detail, happy to take questions. So let me turn to those immediately. In terms of the international factors, I think the context in which countries always have to interact, what IR scholars like to call international anarchy, means that states have to worry about the possibility that they'll have to provide for their own security. That leads them to worry about their vulnerabilities, especially when they find themselves in these relationships of rivalry. And so I think it's not surprising that before the pandemic, the United States and China under President Trump and under President Xi in China have each been quite worried about their vulnerabilities in terms of their dependence on the other side for certain economic inputs. For the United States, this has been concerns about inputs from China in the global supply chains. From the Chinese perspective, it's been dependence on American technologies for key parts of the leading edge of the Chinese economy as it modernizes. And so we saw this trend towards pulling back, decoupling, whatever you want to call it, before the pandemic. I think the pandemic is exacerbating that. And we see that especially in the United States with the calls to reduce American dependence on China for pharmaceuticals, concerns about the fact that the US seems to have to rely on China for masks and ventilators and respirators and gowns and all that stuff. So decoupling is being pushed forward. Second thing about the second international factor that I'd emphasize is that China and the United States clearly stand apart from all other countries in the world in the second, third decade of the 21st century by their massive capabilities. And what that means is they focus like a laser beam on each other in terms of their international standing and the risks that each could pose for the other. There's a widening of the competition. There's a tendency to more closely monitor one another. And so we see in the relationship that the United States has pushed back, perhaps in an exaggerated and distorted way, to China's Belt and Road Initiative internationally, and the Chinese tout the Belt and Road as perhaps more than it really is. And I think with the pandemic, we see this as well in terms of the way in which each side has been sniping at the other, blaming the other and criticizing the other's international response in terms of providing assistance to other countries, and claims this is all just an attempt to get a leg up in their international competition. In terms of domestic politics, I think the two things to focus on are kind of narrow political considerations. And in the U.S. China as the U.S.-China rivalry has deepened, I think it's clear there's a bipartisan shift towards competition to adopt a more hardline stance towards China in the United States. And I think electoral pressures in the United States are going to intensify that attempt to race towards a harsher line on China. I think in China as well, some of the insecurities of an authoritarian regime lead the Chinese leadership to want to take, because they're concerned about what political scientists call performance legitimacy. They're concerned to demonstrate to the Chinese people that they can stand up to the United States. So on both sides, you have domestic political tendencies that are going to make it hard to compromise over various issues. And I think in the context of the pandemic, we're seeing this as well with domestic political actors on both sides, all the way going almost all the way to the top on both sides, leveling charges against one another that in part are for domestic political purposes. Finally, in terms of competing values in the two countries, when I think about this domestic political factor, I think this is also a set of issues that was already bubbling up. It had been on a low simmer for a number of years in the relationship, but was also already becoming more prominent as the relationship had worsened before the pandemic, especially focused on issues such as events in Hong Kong and China's treatment of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. But I think with the pandemic, what we've seen is that each side tries to claim that this pandemic is revealing the other side's weaknesses and what's wrong with their system, their way of governing and running society, and then also wants to emphasize how the way they're responding reflects all the strengths of their political system, the values that it represents, et cetera. Be happy to talk about any of these points in greater detail and maybe clarify them if people want me to, but I know we want to keep this brief, so I'll yield the floor to the next speaker.
All right, I think that's me, right? Okay, so I would agree with Avery that our U.S.-China relationship, if it's the patient, it has a lot of pre-existing comorbidities that COVID-19 is just going to exacerbate. But I'm going to give a little bit of a different kind of angle on some of this discussion. I first started working on China in 1995, and I remember the first proposal that I wrote to get funding for a China program. The sentence, it started with the sentence, China is at a crossroads. And of course, the crossroads in 1995 was, is China a weak state destined to collapse? Or was it a strong state able to promote economic reform and burnish its global standing while maintaining one-party rule? 25 years later, and especially in light of COVID-19, we're still asking the same question. Is China weak or is China strong as a result of the current circumstances? Undoubtedly, while China's still at a crossroads, that crossroads is now dotted with award-winning architectural buildings sitting on all four corners, high-end malls, and each of those buildings and a high-speed train running through it. But if you look at the coverage of China post the Wuhan shutdown, you would not be alone if you came away confused. Has COVID and China's handling of the outbreak left the party stronger or weaker? There's a lot of analysis that points to both conclusions. On the weak side, the analysis suggests that things were very weak in China before COVID-19, and things have only gotten worse. Min-Shin Pei, who many of our listeners may be familiar with, has an article on Foreign Affairs, a recent article on Foreign Affairs titled China's Coming Upheaval, Coronavirus, Competition, and the Weakness of Xi Jinping. Pei, similar to other analysts who take this position, describes a series of factors. He calls China brittle. He calls the CCP brittle. And he points to things like Xi's decision to replace consensus decision-making and eminent pragmatism with strongman rule, founded more on ideology than on pragmatic considerations of how to run the country. Evidence dating back now several years that the quote-unquote China miracle is over, pointing to slower economic growth rates. China's ill-advised investments in the Belt and Road Initiative, where political considerations have arguably trumped sound investment policy, and what he calls China's decision to antagonize developed countries like the U.S., Japan, and European powers while cultivating relationships with less developed countries. So those are the pre-existing factors that made China brittle. And then you lay on top of this China's flawed response to the coronavirus, in particular with regard to issues of transparency, free speech, and tolerance of criticism in Chinese society. And he would argue what was brittle now is on the brink of breaking. And certainly you see this reflected in internal analysis coming out of China. There's a lot of discussion on the Chinese internet about weaknesses of the CCP leadership. The phrase "we want freedom of speech" was posted millions of times in February after Dr. Li Wenyang's death. And you had the recent charging of Ren Zhiqiang, who's a well-known Chinese, well-known critic of the party, who wrote, among other things, maybe simply trusting the people with freedom of speech could have already achieved a great victory in preventing and managing this epidemic, and there wouldn't be such a huge price to pay. So that's the China weak side. On the China strong side, there's similarly a lot of analysis coming out that suggests that China will be stronger both internally and externally as a result of the pandemic. And here you have there's an article by Kurt Campbell and Rush Doshi in the most recent issue of Foreign Affairs titled "Coronavirus Could Reshape the Global Order: China is maneuvering for leadership as the U.S. falters." It describes this moment as America's Suez moment, suggesting that America's influence as a global power could be extinguished if it does not change course and show leadership at home and abroad in responding to this crisis. Interestingly, the China strong commentary highlights some of the same evidence as the China weak analysis, only to draw different conclusions. And it points to the US's retreat from the world stage, from global leadership under President Trump, which has created a vacuum for China to fill. It looks at the donations and offers of support that China has been making with regard to global health policy and global health cooperation, to suggest that China is going to come out stronger and in a position as a global leader. And it even points to things like Belt and Road, as well as South China Sea, to suggest that China is able to project power externally in a way that it never has been before. And similarly, as you had critics in China, you also have proponents or advocates in China who see this as a moment to hold up the success of the Chinese model. We had the sort of Beijing-Washington consensus debate a few years ago, and now you see it resurrected, but in the context of the Chinese model, Chinese political system and Chinese society is better prepared to fight a global pandemic than democratic countries. In reality, in both China and the United States, the government was slow to respond to the crisis for essentially the same reason, namely a fear that being truthful about the scope of the pandemic would undermine public faith in the leadership. That looks very different in authoritarian China as it does in sort of the democratic United States, but they're essentially the same concerns drove decision-making early on in the response to the epidemic. And of course, the missteps by both governments have furthered frustration of some people in their countries, while now we're going to see is the response able to shore up support from the base in both countries. So coming back to our opening question, has COVID weakened China and the Communist Party leadership, or has it strengthened it? And is the US strengthened or weakened as a result? One of the things I've had a little bit of time to do in the last few weeks is read some of the great books that you're seeing behind me. And I enjoyed particularly looking at Salman Khan's book, Haunted by Chaos, which is a look at grand strategy in communist China. He has a line in there that I think sums up where we are. And he writes, since 1949, Chinese leaders have aspired to be a great power, but with great power comes great insecurity. And I think that explains that, China is both strong and weak as it recovers from COVID-19. And we're going to have to sort of reckon with that paradox as we move into the future.
Jacques. Things about, oops, am I still muted here?
You're good.
Okay, I'm muted, okay. So one of the things about being the third speaker on a panel of three is a lot of the good stuff has already been said, and I agree with pretty much everything Avery and Amy have addressed, but let me just add a few details here and there. Fully share Avery's sense that what's going on with COVID-19 in the U.S.-China relationship is reflecting and exacerbating problems that were already there. In fact, Avery and I have an introductory chapter coming out eventually in an edited volume that really looks at the roots of this, that goes back to really the Obama years. We start to see the bipartisan consensus in favor of engagement with China turn into a bipartisan, more negative view, indeed, as Avery suggested, competition to be tougher on China. So there's been that long-standing, long-emerging pivot. But in some ways, COVID is almost a perfect storm on this. I mean, I don't have time to go too much to the China side, but on the US side of it, it played to sort of every piece of the Trump administration and Trump negativity on China. I mean, you get to be nativist, you get to shut down travel, you get to call it the Wuhan virus, and you get to beat up on the WHO as a UN-centered institution and call it too close to China. So it's just this almost perfect storm to push that narrative, although it's, of course, as always with this administration, mixed with paeans to how wonderful the Trump-Xi relationship is. But I think this may actually be more than epiphenomenal. It may feed into some of this, as Avery said, making some of it worse. But I think part of what we're seeing on the US side in the context of COVID is that while we know the view had gone negative on China in a bipartisan way, in a sense, this has created the incentive, particularly on the right wing of the Republican Party, to be even more negative on China. So although there is this bipartisan shift toward negativity, how bad that was going to go, how far that was going to go into sort of full Cold War mode, I think has been more up in the air, and this, I think, nudges it in that direction. On the specific issue of decoupling, which Avery also got into a little bit, I think COVID has added a few things. To some degree, the concerns were already there, but what we see coming out of this is adding a kind of national economic security dimension. It has underscored the vulnerability of supply chains to a breakout in China of a disease. Ironically, now that it's gone pandemic, it's disrupted everywhere, but I think it brought home this notion of the heavy dependence on one source being a national economic security problem. And of course, there's the kind of flat out national physical security problem that comes with the dependence for masks, ventilators, reagents, and various other things that are also heavily sourced in China. When you layer on that at least hints of it disrupting the supply chains and sort of prohibiting exports and things like that, that becomes all the more threatening. So I think it's put another somewhat infectious, unwashed thumb on that side of the scale, on the more negative take on bilateral relations. What I want to do with my remaining time here, I think I do have something, is turn to what I think the battle externally is on this. And in that sense, you know, what does this do to the U.S. China rivalry? Has it gone viral, as it were? And in a sense, it has, I think, in that there are two competing narratives out there. One is about competence. And there, China started out definitely in a hole. There was regulatory failure in terms of the wet markets, or perhaps the lab, less probably, that was the source of this. The failure of the mechanisms put in place after the SARS epidemic to make sure the warnings got up the chain early and there was a response, the cover up, the silencing of critics, all of that sort of thing. That's a big hole to be in the first place. But China has, I think, quite adeptly played up the success of containment. Now, it's a fragile success. The numbers that are being reported are questionable, partly for possibly politically manipulated reasons, partly just because this is tough to track. And any recovery is fragile. Eruptions may occur. But the competence narrative really is partly the U.S. being absent from the field. That is, the U.S. having done a terribly incompetent job for reasons that we all know, makes the Chinese response look fairly effective. The second battle over narrative is about providing international public goods. Now here, China also started out in a hole. The lack of transparency, the failure to stop it from happening, the sense that contagion was spreading from China to other places. But again, there's been a pretty impressive attempt to recover from that. Partly that was inevitable because China is in the supply chain for all the stuff the world needs, so it's seen as the source of these things, and rightly so. But part of it also is the diplomatic play of making donations, although this too was marred a bit by the embargo, by some quality questions, and by suspicions of a political agenda, but still it's a pretty significant move. And also, not to be underplayed, that China is offering expertise. We handled the argument is we handled this public health threat, and here are experts going out to Italy and other places to provide advice. But here again, the Chinese advantage in this public goods narrative is partly there because of the US disadvantage. The instinct to blame China, to hold up the G7 statement, if you don't call it the Wuhan virus, to go after the WHO, and the attempt to embargo US supplies PPE from going out of the country or even being shipped by US manufacturers to third countries. Final thing I'll close on here is to look at the other players for just a second. In some sense, the real success, the real competence stories aren't the US or China. It's South Korea, Taiwan, to a degree Hong Kong, and initially, although not more recently, Singapore. And so you can see competent responses, early responses, that are way more competent than the US and more competent than China, and way less authoritarian than China or even what the US has had to come into. Final thing I'll mention is the WHO and the Taiwan issue, which is always looming here. This is also kind of a replay of SARS. Because of Beijing's opposition, Taiwan doesn't get to engage fully with the WHO. Because that was seen as a problem that made Taiwan and therefore the rest of the world in turn vulnerable to the SARS outbreak a decade and a half ago. That's what got a degree of opening and got Taiwan into dealing with the WHO. But that dealing is now lost again because of the current president in Taiwan being especially not to Beijing's liking. And it is true, certainly, that Taiwan overplays, perhaps for political purposes, the consequences of exclusion. But when you have a pandemic like this, it's bad for the public goods narrative and it's bad for international public health to squeeze any frontline entity out of that kind of engagement. And then we got, just recently the additional layer that makes a mess of that with the WHO Director General talking about racist comments from Taiwan's social media. This is not, in my view, the moment to be beating up on the WHO, but it's getting beat up on from Washington and elsewhere. So with that, I'll stop and throw it back to Mike.
Thanks so much, Jacques. I want to pick up on something that that you mentioned in your discussion of the narrative, and I'm curious what all of you think, which is the sort of Chinese claim of success. China's claim that they've had about 82,000 coronavirus cases for the better part of a month. Not that other countries don't have their own issues with data, but how credible do you think that is based on your reading of what's going on in China? I'd open this up for any of you that want to jump in.
So you kind of hinted at something that I want to emphasize, which is that the numbers are bad everywhere. We don't know how many cases have not been tested for in a variety of countries and how many deaths have gone unreported because they haven't taken place in hospitals and weren't detected as COVID. There's reason to suspect that the Chinese numbers are maybe even worse than in some other places in terms of their validity. However, I would say that as in many things, look at what they're doing, not what they're saying in terms of reporting. And I think monitoring how they open certain businesses and certain social settings and then close them down again tells you that there's cases that are making them nervous. However, my guess is that it's not the orders of magnitude that some more conservative think tanks in the United States have been suggesting, especially because I think the reports were either yesterday or today that China has decided to reopen schools for kids in the big cities. And if that happens, that tells me that they've gotten pretty confident that it may, the numbers may not be zero, but they are manageable.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think to the extent that we have distortion in the Chinese numbers so far, they're probably from that initial outbreak early phase where, it was kind of chaotic, it was kind of closed down, and it's hard to measure those. But I would agree with Avery that the signs of the willingness to open up and all of that suggests that there is at least a sense that it's under control. And again, the numbers are bad many places. They're especially bad here with the lack of testing. Now, the reasons behind inaccurate numbers are somewhat similar and somewhat different depending on the two systems, but I would be more suspicious of the initial outbreak than, we're probably still seeing over-optimistic statements, but again, as Avery says, they wouldn't be taking this risk unless they thought there was a pretty good chance of keeping it under control.
And I would only add, not being a data scientist, it's hard to comment. Clearly, there's a lot of evidence that there's differences in how different countries are collecting and compiling data, which Avery alluded to. What I do think is really interesting in China is kind of the societal response, and I don't think it should be analyzed or undervalued that in China, as in Hong Kong, as in Taiwan, as in other countries in Southeast Asia and Singapore, the experience of SARS, the 2002-2003 outbreak of a novel coronavirus loomed very, very large. And so both the infrastructure that some of these countries had in place to respond to the crisis, but also, just an individual person's response in terms of, taking the warning seriously, staying home, practicing social distancing. I think they were more attuned to taking some of those steps than places that just didn't have that experience 15, 17 years ago.
The next question for me comes from one of our guests who is from New York and works for the mayor's office actually, and is asking about the difference between the national level trends that all of you mentioned and the possibility for sort of city to city cooperation, particularly when it comes to purchasing equipment, et cetera. And that given the way that global supply chains work now, of course, a lot of the protective equipment that American hospitals may need are in China. How do you all see things operating at the sub-national level when it comes to U.S. China cooperation, given the trends that all of you identified at the national level?
You don't want to pick one of us to toss that at?
Amy, why don't you go first?
Sure. So one of the biggest issues facing the U.S.-China relationship for the last 2 years has been this sort of drumbeat of that has raised the specter that any collaboration, particularly I'm thinking about in science and technology, between the United States and China is somehow threatening to national security. Right, and that has been something that we as a university community have been looking at very carefully with a lot of concern, frankly. I am very hopeful, and you started to see some evidence of this, that the challenges of COVID have made global collaboration in science and technology paramount, right? So you see reports of Chinese scientists and U.S. scientists and scientists from around the world meeting regularly, talking regularly, medical practitioners, sharing ideas. And I think that we will be led out of this in some ways by global collaboration in the science and technology sphere. And I think that will have a kind of pushback effect on that drumbeat narrative that was coming out of DC that somehow this cooperation was very dangerous for the United States. I think that will extend to the subnational kind of cooperation that you and Lolita Jackson, who raised the question, were mentioning. I think there is a great possibility here for cities to work together, for corporate entities to work together. And don't forget, there are a lot of powerful corporations in China now and business leaders who can play a role in forging these kinds of national level, non-state to state level dialogues and conversations. So I am very hopeful that this raises the potential or capability for collaboration and cooperation in a whole range of areas that China and the United States and others can be a part of.
Just 2 quick points on supply chains and city-to-city cooperation or state-to-state. One of the things, or state to province, one of the things that I think is most infuriating when thinking about this challenge, because I think Amy's right that there are local leaders in both countries, not just in the academic communities, who want to engage in this trade. One of the most frustrating things has been the tariffs that were put into place. And it really is kind of mind-boggling that in the context of the pandemic, that one of the first things the Trump administration did not do was to say we are at least temporarily suspending the tariffs on all relevant goods that can provide PPE to Americans who need these, and medical workers on the front lines in American cities and across the United States. That was, in my mind, a huge mistake. In fact, it would be better to say we're dropping the tariffs permanently, but that's a separate topic. Secondly, I think the response that I mentioned in my comments about the trend towards reinforcing decoupling and it focusing right now on PPE and other kinds of relevant goods, I think gets at a deeper issue, which is I think the leaders of cities, the heads of companies understand that you want to diversify your supply chains, but if you want to go for self-sufficiency, we don't want to depend on supply chains outside the United States for a variety of goods, including some of these medical goods. What you're asking for is a much less efficient production of these goods at a higher price and perhaps setting you up for the possibility that at a moment where your country might need these goods and the sources in your country can't provide them, that others will be more reluctant to provide them. So rather than saying we have to become self-reliant, I think the right line of argumentation here is to say what we need to do is diversify beyond China, but to sustain a healthy working relationship with China because they are a producer of some of these goods, high quality, relatively low price.
Just real quickly on this, I think once we got past the initial moment where there might have been embargoes, then sort of some of the things that are the underpinning and the strength of the relationship are in place, which is the U.S.-China economic relationship is incredibly diffuse and incredibly dense, and it's mostly market-based transactions. And so what you see are, as I understand it, U.S. local governments in conjunction with U.S. local private businesses, or maybe not so local ones, working their connections and contacts in China, which have been built up through many, many years of these kinds of arrangements. And that stuff still goes on at a kind of market-based level beneath the noise of the sort of rhetoric you see at the national level. And Chinese local governments and U.S. local governments of years have been building up sister city and sister province and state type relationships. And those are the kind of channels that can help when you don't have either an embargo or a centralized procurement process that might be undertaken through the DPA or something like that.
Yeah, I don't want to hog the time, but one last thing I would toss in here is the need for cooperation on regulatory regimes. Because one of the problems is when you get in these situations, there's all kinds of shady characters trying to sell this stuff and buyers may not be aware. And in fact, both on the Chinese side and the American side, there's a need for better regulation and cooperation to ensure that the masks that are coming to the United States or to other countries, being exported to other countries, in fact, are up to snuff.
So our next question comes from a few different people in the Q&A have asked variants of this. The United States and China, our conversation up to this point has mostly been about economic competition, but of course there's military competition between the United States and China as well. And you have the recently signed Taipei Act, for example, in the United States. To what extent do you think this crisis could provide an opportunity, as the U.S. is distracted for, why don't we say, greater Chinese assertiveness with regard to Taiwan and the South China Sea? Or is that something we shouldn't really be worried about? Avery, maybe you could lead us off.
Okay, the easy answer is you always have to be worried about it. You always have to be prepared. I wouldn't assign it a high probability. I never say never, certainly not after 2016. But I would say that I think both the United States and China at this moment have their hands full and would only make their situation worse if they somehow found themselves stumbling into a militarized conflict, either over the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea. That said, if either side were provoked in ways that they've always said they would have to respond, if the other side took certain actions, I don't think the pandemic would stop them from taking those actions. But I don't think they're going to go look for trouble.
I'd agree with that. And on the specific example you raised, the Taipei Act, that's one of a series of pieces of legislation that have come out of Congress recently that are meant to be sort of pro-Taiwan. I would caution people in both Beijing and Taipei not to overread that kind of legislation. It doesn't really purport to require very much. The executive branch makes policy on its own with relatively little congressional control on that front. So while it would provide a pretext if one were looking for trouble, I would agree with Avery that nobody's really looking for additional trouble right now.
So a lot of people have chimed in the Q&A and asked questions about the pace of China's response and Chinese domestic politics. And Amy, I'm going to look to you to kick us off in this. The question essentially is, if you look at this, speaks a little bit to what both you and Jacques sort of mentioned in your initial remarks. Comparing China to other countries in the region, I think there are some that felt like China's response was delayed. Would you agree with that characterization? And if so, what do you think explains the variation in China's initial response to COVID-19 compared to some other countries in its neighborhood?
Well, the response was certainly delayed, right? I mean, there's evidence now that the first cases were being seen in November. Certainly by end of December, it was clear to, even ophthalmologists like Li Wenliang. I mean, he was not someone who was working in an emergency room or in an ICU or in a, he was an eye doctor who saw that this was happening in his hospital. So it had clearly percolated, and that was December 31st, I think, was his email to his WeChat group. So it clearly percolated, to a level where it was, becoming commonly known, at least in probably medical communities by December. And you didn't have reports, until mid to sort of second, third week of January, and the Wuhan shutdown was January 23rd. So, there's certainly a delayed response. What explains it? I mean, on the one hand, as we've, I think as Jacques mentioned, the ability of national governments to respond to local crises like this is probably, it's probably not its top capability. But, what has bedeviled China is lack of transparency, lack of freedom of speech, and in particular, lack of tolerance for public criticism, right? So that's why Li Wenliang got scolded, as have many others at this point. And it's that is a fundamental weakness. I mean, when the AIDS crisis broke out in the United States, there were officials in the CDC who sort of saw this as a great mystery to be solved, right? Why were young men in places like San Francisco and New York dying of things that they had never died from before? What was the source of this? And there's, I think, a lot of public and personal satisfaction to be derived from being the person who could figure that out and help to contribute to mitigating those problems facing the United States in the 1980s. I don't know that culture of kind of investigation and getting to the source of the problem and being the person or group or institution that can solve that societal problem, really resonates in China currently. And that's, that I think explains, to some extent why the response was delayed, and is something to really consider and examine going forward.
I'd agree that a significant part of it is the lack of transparency in the sense of, shutting up people on social media and the constraints on the regular media. That's a big part of it. There's also a bureaucratic piece to the story, which is, I think, China sincerely did try to put in place incentives and mandates not to repeat SARS, the attempt to keep it quiet. But it's very, very hard to change the incentives to local level officials who constantly face this double or nothing bet. I've got a problem here. If I can keep it controlled and deal with it quietly, then I skate along without any black marks. If I do a bad job and it explodes, I'm in big trouble. But by that point, you've already made your bet. So this incentive to report bad news up, I think, is not. The disincentive to do that has not fully been dealt with, even though there were steps in that direction, trying to learn the lesson from SARS. And then once you do get on the radar screen, it happens rather late, but once it does get on the policy agenda, then you can see a very strong reaction, as we did. That is building walls, shutting things down, shutting down transportation, sending in thousands of medical workers from around the country and things like that. But that initial phase, there are still incentives to cover up.
Just a couple of things. One is, I think we got to keep in mind that China first formally notified international health authorities, including the United States, on January 3rd, that in fact they were dealing with something that they didn't fully understand yet. And I don't think we want to underestimate the extent to which not really understanding what they were dealing with, combined with all the informational problems in an authoritarian regime, was a toxic mix. The other thing is, while I agree with Amy about the scientists' reaction to HIV/AIDS and all that stuff, the policy response in the United States was tragic and way too slow. And the Reagan administration's performance on that was horrible. So, every country can screw up in different ways. The problem on the Chinese side, I think, is that it's, pretty apparent to us that this was a predictable malady of their, the way in which their bureaucracy functions, and that, the problem of changing the way people habitually respond to the challenges they face is, as Jacques said, something that's going to be tougher to wipe out than just changing rules.
And just to underscore, it's one thing to be slow in responding in late December into January, as China can be charged with. It's another thing to be slow in responding in January and February and March and April.
Who's that?
Oh, I don't know, some country somewhere.
Okay.
So we've had a couple questions have asked about sort of variances, packaging a few different questions about whether, and this gets you, it says a U.S. foreign policy question. So maybe we start with, why don't we start with, I don't think we started with Jacques yet for an answer. So Jacques, you'll go first for this one. The question is, is the Trump administration trying to have its cake and eat it too, in a way, and in relying on China for supplies, but also talking about, using phrases like the Wuhan virus and those sorts of issues? Is there a contradiction there? I mean, one understands maybe why the president would wish to do both of those things, but are there likely to be consequences for that? And would you push back against that characterization? A few different people have asked variants of that in the Q&A.
No, I think there is clearly a tension there. The rhetoric is to blame China, but yes, the reliance is still there. I think it's not all that surprising in the sense that what the Trump administration has said and done about China has always had this strange bifurcated quality to it. I mean, we get a lot of China bashing, and then we get this great personal relationship such to work things out. She's handling Hong Kong well, he's handling Hong Kong terribly. I mean, so this has been all over the map. So one could imagine in other circumstances, something like that might trigger some head scratching and rethinking in Beijing. But at this point, I think a lot of it is baked in. And that although you do see, again, China's a highly complex place. There's no one way of looking at this, even in policy relevant circles. But I think over the last 3 years, there's been a certain accommodation to the idea that the overall relationship has taken a significant downward turn. But along that trend line, there are these wild gyrations sometimes coexisting. So I don't think it would change anything in any simple causal way. I do worry that these create pretexts for uncooperative behavior if someone chooses to seize on them for that purpose.
Yeah, I basically agree. But I will say that on the American side anyway, we know a lot less about what goes on in the Chinese side in terms of foreign policy decision-making. But on the American side, I think there's a pattern, as Jacques suggests, that's already kind of baked into the Trump administration. And that is that most of the foreign policy advisors in the Trump administration are all for a pretty hard line on China. And that occasionally the president decides to kind of clean up the mess that gets created. And he, along with probably Mr. Mnuchin, are the cleanup team. But as long as, in this context of the pandemic, Peter Navarro is playing a larger and larger role on the response and dealing with China also, I think that's pointing to greater problems down the road.
Amy, you want to jump in on this one?
No, I think.
So then why don't we get off of
the idea that the Trump administration has been inconsistent in its approach to China is not novel, right? This has been a consistent inconsistency for the last 3 years.
Another pre-existing condition.
Yes.
Why don't we? So the next question, actually, Amy, why don't we start with you, since you in your role at Penn may have some thoughts on this. A few different people have asked questions either in the chat or the Q&A about whether the three of you see the context of U.S. China tension related to the virus as whether that will lead to growing anti-Chinese sentiment at a personal level from anywhere from, some people have asked about in Philadelphia, some people have asked about, in the United States. Do you think that this is that to what extent do you view that as a serious concern? And, and if so, what should we be doing about it?
I think it's a very serious concern. And it, it's not just anti-Chinese, right? It's anti-Asian. And it affects, international visitors to the United States, but it also affects Americans, right? I mean, they are feeling this very acutely too. I think that we need to be aware of it. We need to speak out against it. We need to provide support to communities who, are feeling this pressure and intense scrutiny. We need to look at it as a public safety and a public safety issue. So providing information and guidance to local law enforcement so that they can be on the front lines of helping to respond to this. I mean, I don't think we should just sweep this under the rug, and it's something that we need to look at very seriously, and we'll probably need to look at for many months, right? It's not something that has just kind of flared up in the last couple of weeks and will go away. It will probably linger for a while, and so we need to address it as a long-term concern, not just a temporary concern.
Yeah, it's not just Jacques, did you want to go?
I didn't say that.
Okay. I mean, it's not just an attitude or a perspective. I mean, there are consequences, and I've heard from colleagues and friends who have had experiences that really are kind of, what's the right word, disconcerting at best. People, it's just another manifestation of racism. And because when you talk about this being the Chinese virus, of course, many Americans can't distinguish among various East Asian population groups, and those who happen to be Americans of Asian heritage get targeted for no good reason other than people are doing, the people doing this kind of stuff are people doing bad things in bad times, and it's bringing the worst out in some people. The difference is if this were a virus that started in Berlin or in Germany, most Americans would have a hard time telling whether Mike Horowitz was of German ancestry or of Polish ancestry. But with Asians, Caucasian Americans in particular, but it's not just Caucasian Americans. There's some other groups doing this as well. From their perspective, it's real easy to identify who an Asian American is.
And again, it's layered on something that's, this isn't out of nowhere. It's layered on the U.S. China rivalry that we've been talking about being put in increasingly racial terms over the last few years. And, it's the next ugly step down that path.
So the next question I want to pick up, somebody asked a question in the Q&A about the Uyghurs, and part of the conversation, or I would say a key part of the conversation about China in the United States prior to the outbreak was about the measures the Chinese government's been undertaking in Xinjiang. To what that's fallen off the radar in many ways from an American perspective in the China conversation, given what's going on with coronavirus. So wondering if any of you, and I'm not actually sure who to call on first for this one, so volunteer for whoever wants to go first. To what extent, what's going on in Xinjiang with regard to response to the virus, and to what extent should we be talking about that more?
Our silence speaks volumes. I don't think we know exactly what's going on in Xinjiang during the pandemic. As we know in the United States, there's a problem in the correctional facilities with the spread of the disease. Who knows what's going on in the camps where Uyghurs have been concentrated, and if the virus had spread there, I would expect it's a bad situation, but I don't have any facts, so I can't say.
I mean, you do have the combination of people in prison-like facilities, and of course, poor medical infrastructure, poor infrastructure in general, which we know in the U.S. and elsewhere is correlated with bad results. In terms of the politics of your question, certainly it's shoved it off the radar screen. We're now talking about all COVID all the time. I think what was going on in Xinjiang was in many ways the most underreported human rights story out of China in a long time.
Yeah.
There are reasons for that. Muslim countries, by and large, have not stood up for the Uyghurs, partly out of concerns about diplomatic relations with China. And the U.S. has not pressed the Uyghur issue the way it might others, although it's done some. The Uyghurs are not as appealing as the Tibetans to the outside world. They don't have that kind of good press, as it were. And many of the things that were causing friction in global views of China have disappeared for now behind the coronavirus. Certainly Xinjiang is one, the Hong Kong protests are another. The protests aren't happening partly because of the virus. And so that's dropped off the agenda as well.
I mean, I would just add that I can't imagine the situation has improved at all in Xinjiang. If anything, I'm sure that COVID-19 and the government response to it has made it more likely that the government and the party are using repressive measures. There is a big discussion around surveillance, both digital and analog, for lack of a better term. The return of the neighborhood committees in China and the rise of kind of local community surveillance and people enforcing these things. That has increased throughout China, and we know that surveillance, both digital and analog, has been used in places like Xinjiang, but also in other minority communities like Tibetans, as a means of exerting repressive tactics to corral and control those populations. So I can only imagine it has, if it hasn't gotten worse, it certainly hasn't gotten better.
So the next question I want to ask is about, it's a question that's come up in a couple of different ways about what we can do. with the notion being that if there's misinformation surrounding coronavirus in general, and certainly with regards to both what's happening in China, and and some might say that there's a lack of transparency in the American conversation as well. As individuals of the world, we're all four of us are in the United States right now. What should we be doing to try to get real information and to try to use that to influence our own behavior?
Contact tracing. In other words, when you get information, don't take it at face value. Find out where the information's from, verify it, go to multiple sources, and if possible, especially if it's a claim about the virus itself or what works or what doesn't work or what is working, to the extent you can find scientists talk, not political scientists, but natural scientists talking about these things, epidemiologists, virologists, physicians at the front line. Those are the people to look to for facts, not CNN or Fox News or MSNBC, because I've seen way too many stories on there that are just not well sourced. Let's put it that way.
Maybe Jacques, do you want to jump in?
I think that's right, and ideally one goes to those kind of primary sources, and short of that, be an intelligent consumer of media. Not all media is the same. There's some that do a better job of curating, preferably the ones that aren't, your friends on or your acquaintances on Facebook or shouting cable news.
So I'm wondering, the next question, actually, let me lead off with Amy or Jacques. It's sort of a jump ball for maybe one of the two of you to lead. Xi's power has obviously grown over the last several years, and you touched on this you both touched on this in different ways in your opening remarks, but we've gotten several questions sort of asking about, how is this affecting his reputation among the people of China? And to what extent, and how will that change if many people, including Penn's own Zika Manual, have argued that responding to coronavirus may be a bit of a roller coaster, where it goes, but the oscillations will get smaller, but there will be multiple sort of oscillations. If that's true in China as well, how will that affect Xi?
Who do you want to start on that?
Amy, why don't you lead us off?
I was going to say I would defer to Jacques.
All right, Alphonse and Gaston.
I think
Amy did a lot of this in her initial remarks, which is there is this, when she was talking about Chinese Communist Party strong or weak, that's partly a Xi Jinping strong or weak story. So limits to his weakness, certainly. I mean, there was I think some very loose talk about this being a Chernobyl moment. They wrong-footed the response so badly that the trust in the government was going to collapse, and you'd see that sort of thing. That strikes me as always overplayed. The Chinese regime is not that fragile. And then Xi, is a singularly powerful top leader of the type we haven't seen in a while. And unless there is a really massive eruption of coronavirus, I don't see this as creating the kind of social crisis in China that would put a leader in grave difficulty. The other thing is, if you're a top leader, the question always is compared to what? So Xi certainly has his frailties, but one thing he's been very good about is making sure he doesn't have a lot of peers or near peers. This is not, a leadership that is in any meaningful way collective. The weaknesses for him are that because he has gathered so much power and even more of the attention toward power in his own hands, he's jokingly referred to as the chairman of everything. Everything's being run through these leading small groups that he puts together. So Amy did the variation on the Spider-Man with great power comes great responsibility reference, with insecurity and responsibility. So there's this sense that he kind of gets blamed when things go wrong in a way that wouldn't have been true in a more institutionalized system, which China seemed to be inching toward pre-Xi. But is doing less. The other thing is, among Xi's critics, it feeds this narrative of he's overmatched by crises. He misplayed how to play Trump in the U.S. in the trade war. He misplayed Hong Kong. The Taiwan strategy blew up in his face, and now this. So there starts to build this narrative of he's faced with crises and he doesn't handle them all that well. What he's still got going for him is the people who point that out tend to wind up silenced.
And I would just add that, and Jacques, you made this point really well. It's a there's a lot of comparison going on, right? So in late January and February, when things were looking very bleak in China, and there was a significant outpouring on the Chinese internet of frustration and criticism. In light of how this has played out now around the world, Jacques, I think you called it a competence problem. I mean, Chinese competence, has now been restored somewhat. I mean, it may be premature, it may be fragile, it may yet get tested again. But she does not look, the party, the party's response does not look as weak now as it did 2 months ago, when it alone was in the spotlight for under the being scrutinized for how should a federal government, national government respond to something like this.
Avery, you want to jump in, or?
Yeah, sort of a related point, which is I think that all of us may be overestimating the extent to which people will be given credit or blame for these outcomes, or should be, based on competence or on the defects of the political systems in either country. I think we may be underestimating just how powerful nature is as opposed to human beings. And of course, go to the ultimate authoritative source these days, Anthony Fauci. And I remember seeing an interview with him, I think earlier this week, where somebody asked him, well, could the Chinese have stopped this and we wouldn't have had the pandemic if they did the right thing? And he said, no. He said, better response by China from the beginning would have slowed it and we'd have more time to get ready. And of course, that begs the question, if it had been less dramatic in China and exploding, would everybody have noticed and gotten ready better than they didn't get ready this time? So I think part of it, he was just saying that there probably wasn't any way to stop this pandemic given the nature of the virus. That's a possibility. I don't know whether he's right or wrong, but it is possible that we're facing a force from nature that is going to swamp the best efforts in the United States, best efforts in China to cope with it. It may come back resurgent in China again. It may reflect the failures of the Chinese system, or it may reflect the strengths of the virus.
On that cheery note, let me take us out with one last question that I'd like each of you to answer, and maybe Amy, you can go first for this one. Sort of briefly, we've talked a lot about how things have gone wrong, but what if they don't from here? What if things get better? Imagine a world where U.S. China relations have improved, say, 9 months from now. Put issues surrounding the American election aside. Tell me a story where things get better between the United States and China, and tell me why.
Well, this is like, make up a headline. The made up headline that I would like to see, or the headline I would like to see is, U.S. and Chinese scientists collaborate to develop vaccine. I mean, I think that something like that would demonstrate, the mutual dependencies that we have on each other to really address the greatest challenges facing our world. I would add, I have been personally so moved by the inquiries that we've received and the outreach we've received from partners in China. People, university partners have sent tens of thousands of masks and N95 masks and the spacesuits that the Chinese doctors wear to the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania. I mean, that kind of people-to-people collaboration, is very touching. It was very moving, and it came almost instantaneously. So yes, I guess the headline I would like to see is U.S. and China, or a global coalition of scientists develop a vaccine.
Jacques?
I would agree with a lot of that. I think that would be the headline. I suspect the stuff that doesn't make headlines that would be the possible good news, because it's a little slower, is two things. One is everybody's going to want economic recovery and want economic recovery badly. And that means hopefully getting the global economy roaring again, because you're not going to reorient those supply chains immediately. The other part of it is hopefully near-death experiences lead to serious attempts to prevent the next one. So collaboration not just on a vaccine, but on how to deal with future pandemics. Maybe in a more ideal world, even thinking about climate change, which is the slow motion COVID in some sense. Cooperation to deal with truly global problems could get back on track. There had been some progress toward that between the U.S. and China years ago. It's fizzled out. This might be the kick in the pants to restart that.
Boss, why don't you take us home?
Okay, well, I know you want optimism, and I'll try to be as optimistic as I can be. I would say that, as Jacques suggested, and as Amy suggested as well, in terms of the cooperation at the people-to-people level, scientist-to-scientist level, I do think that this experience of the pandemic is going to underscore the importance of scientific collaboration. It's going to encourage both countries and other countries as well to understand that decoupling of the scientific communities in general is not a good idea, that you have to figure out how to manage this so that the national security interests of all countries can be ensured, but you got to keep those channels open. The other thing about the near-death experience is I've always thought that the U.S. China relationship was going to have to get even worse than it was before the pandemic, before it got better. And I think one of the things that can come out of this experience on the economic front, on the scientific front, and elsewhere is the understanding that, okay, we're in this relationship that isn't like the old one of in deep engagement in the good old days, but we have to figure out how to manage it more sensibly, because neither country was doing a very good of managing the rivalry. I think managing the rivalry going forward is going to be the key, and maybe the pandemic will help encourage that.
Well, Jacques, Amy, and Avery, thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us. And thanks as well to the Center for the Study of Contemporary China, our partner on this event. We love working with and expect we will continue to, since this discussion is likely to continue moving forward. I hope everyone who's joined us for this event will consider joining us for our two events next week. The first on April 20th, focused on geopolitics and coronavirus, featuring H.R. McMaster, the former National Security Advisor of the United States. And our second on April 21st on the global public health response, featuring Julie Lynch, a political science professor at Penn, and Harvey Rubin, who's joint between the School of Medicine and the School of Engineering and is an expert on infectious diseases. So thank you all for joining us today for the fantastic questions, and hope everybody stays safe and healthy. Have a great day.